That's
Okay, that's working. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate in our Classical Reception seminar series, which is being run in conjunction with the ICS, the Open University, and the Classical Reception Studies Network. It's a great pleasure to introduce today Ika Willis, who has the accolade of being the speaker who's travelled the furthest to be here. Ika is from the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, where she is Associate Professor in English Literatures and has been since 2013. Prior to that, Ika was at the University of Bristol. Ika's main research interests revolve around literary theory, not just focusing on classics, but drawing more broadly on literary and cultural studies. Ika's published widely on pretty much everything from Virgil and Dante to Xena Warrior Princess. And I would particularly recommend her 2017 book, which is just simply titled Reception, which is one of Routledge's new critical idiom series. Today, Ika is going to talk to us about signal boosting and preposterous histories, what reception tells us about the past. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for inviting me. I was completely delighted to be here. It's nice to be back in the UK, and it's always lovely to be at ICS. It's always a good gig. So, over in English Literary Studies, they need our help. In a great essay called Context Stinks, Rita Felsky asks how we can account for the transtemporal movement and power of texts which survive the moment of their initial production and reception and kind of move through time in order to address us in very different contexts and spaces and places that their original writers could not have imagined. Why is it, she asks, that we can feel solicited, buttonholed, stirred up by words that were drafted eons ago? How do texts that are inert in one historical moment become newly revealing, eye-opening, even life-transforming in another? So as classical reception scholars, I think we have some answers to all of those questions, and I think we have a very rich kind of data set to draw on to answer them. I want to start with a short poem by Dorothy Parker called Penelope, which I may be able to read without crying. Let's see. In the pathway of the sun, in the footsteps of the breeze, where the world and sky are one, he shall ride the silver seas, he shall cut the glittering wave. I shall sit at home and rock, rise to heed a neighbour's knock, brew my tea and snip my thread, bleach the linen for my bed, they will call him brave. So this part, I love this poem. It does two things, it does lots of things. It does two things that I'm going to tell you about. First of all, it connects us anachronistically to Penelope, providing what has never perhaps been more accurately called a domesticating translation of the Odyssey. So emphasising points of continuity between the domestic labour of women in the past and women in the contemporary 20th century, with some anachronisms to make the point even clearer. So Penelope's rocking chair, the bleach, the tea. Secondly, in order to make a point about the roles of men and women in the 20th century and about the women's tradition and women's writing history and so on, it writes back to the Odyssey, creating an equivalence between the courage of Odysseus in the masculine, public, action-oriented sphere, the sphere of the metaphorical and the iconic, so he cuts the glittering wave, and Penelope in the feminine, domestic, emotion, and personally oriented sphere, where she's confined to the literal and she snips her thread. Odysseus has access to the metaphorical register, whereas Penelope is kind of obdurately confined to the kind of smallness and literality of little objects. And she has the kind of, the rhyme scheme switches from the more dignified A-B-A-B for Odysseus's stanza to the A-A-B-B of a kind of folk or nursery rhyme for Penelope's stanza. So as much through its form as through its content, it creates a strict equivalence between the activities of Odysseus and Penelope, not least in the strict equivalence of length, one stanza for each spouse, apart from that one line that is stolen from Penelope's stanza and given to Odysseus. They will call him brave. So I've said for the last couple of minutes that it creates an equivalence between Penelope and Odysseus, but of course the question is it Parker who is creating that equivalence, or is it already there in the Odyssey? So Homer, as is well known, uses many of the same epithets for Odysseus and Penelope throughout the epic, including Skeklios, ruthless, and Echephron, cool-headed, which one might think would be confined to the masculine domain, but no, Penelope has them too. And going further, John Winkler in 1990 argued, and I read this as an undergraduate and it stayed with me for a long time, argued that the Odyssey represents the wife and the husband as equals, that the excellence of the husband and the excellence of the wife are of the same kind. So at least for Winkler, the equivalence of worth, the equivalence of courage, the equivalence of value that Parker finds in Odysseus and Penelope is there to be found all along. It's in the Odyssey. This is one reason why when Margaret Atwood wrote the Penelope ad, I was like, there's already a Penelope ad. It's called the Odyssey. So we might think of Parker's poem as a kind of new technology which makes something visible in it, or Winkler's essay, depending on which you read first. A new technology which makes something visible in a text that we haven't seen before. So I'm thinking as a kind of analogy of the ways in which we are now able to physically read some of the letters and the writing on scrolls from Herculaneum and Pompeii because of new imaging technologies, specifically new forms of kind of X-ray scanning. So just as we used to not know what was on these scrolls, but now we have new kinds of material technologies which enable us to see the writing on them for the first time. Similarly, we use kind of different hermeneutic apparatuses, contemporary critical terms and concepts to understand ancient texts. So Don Fowler's essay, Deviant Focalization in Virgil's Aeneid, the notion of deviant focalization is not something that was available to Virgil in those words, at least, but it seems to describe very accurately particular features of the Aeneid which come into sharper focus when we use this technical term as a lens, but which many of us, at least, would believe are there in the Aeneid. We believe that Virgil, to some extent at least, is manipulating point of view, voice, what we now call focalization, and that we are more able to see this feature of the text if we use a kind of contemporary hermeneutic technology or hermeneutic apparatus to look at it. And the Parker poem, I think, is an example of the fact that, like a new technology or a new critical term or a new hermeneutic apparatus, a reception or somebody else's interpretation of a classical text can also direct our gaze so that we see new things in old texts. Mika Bowell takes this argument a little bit further in her book, quoting Caravaggio, and says, art is inevitably engaged with what came before it, and that engagement is an active reworking. It specifies what and how our gaze sees. Hence, the work performed by later images obliterates older images as they were before that intervention and creates new versions of old images instead. So she would say that Parker's poem has in fact obliterated the Odyssey as it was and created a new version in which the equivalence of Odysseus and Penelope is kind of there. And this is a provocative way of putting it. It obliterates the old image and creates a new version of the old image. But as is, I think, often the case, what's provocative about the statement is also what is the most rigorous, that challenges us the most to go beyond our kind of received and sometimes worn out ways of thinking about texts. Because so far I've been using this metaphor of X-rays or lenses or illuminating old texts, which suggests that the things that we're seeing were kind of stably there in the past, in the text, and we can now see them because we've made some kind of progress, whether that's technological, philological, or hermeneutic. So although there is a sense in which the writing on the Herculaneum scrolls is not there in any meaningful way, it's not accessible to us, it's not there, until we have the technology to be able to see it. We do think that what we're seeing is not something that we put there with the X-ray scanner. What's exciting about it, in fact, is that we didn't put it there, is that it was there on the scrolls and has been there for a very long time in an unchanged kind of way. And this model, this way of thinking about interpretation, or the seeing of new things in old texts is often extended from the technological. We are now kind of technically or physically capable of seeing something that is there in the text, extended from that to the hermeneutic. So there's a kind of enduring and attractive popular metaphor of the text as code. So a code that can be cracked when our cryptographic and or computing powers are advanced enough. So we will finally know what the Voynich manuscript says. We will crack the Da Vinci Code. We will crack the Bible code. We will finally find out what these puzzling, complex, multi-layered texts were saying all along. All we need to do is kind of advance our technology far enough. And the human genome is another example where this kind of metaphor of decrypting through scientific or hermeneutic progress, a puzzle that the world has set us, we kind of return to this. But as I think all these examples also suggest, sometimes there is no there. The code is not there to be cracked. And what I mean is that on the one hand, I don't think that Dorothy Parker is kind of simply imposing a 20th century feminism on the Odyssey and seeing something that isn't there in the text. But I also think it's not the case that the equivalence between Odysseus and Penelope is simply there in the text, and Parker and Winkler and other people have found it. This is what, of course, makes reception interesting. And this is something that the biblical reception scholar Yvonne Sherwood talks about very nicely in her book on Jonah, where she points out that the figure of Jonah at one point in history is considered to be the kind of archetype or the type of Christ, and at another point in history, the story is interpreted that Jonah is actually a figure of the Antichrist, of Satan. And she says, Jonah manages to rotate in meaning through 180 degrees. And she goes through the kind of the number of readings of the book that she's going to cover in her long book on Jonah, and says, well, if all these readings are somehow in the text, in essence, then the 48-verse book of Jonah must be an immensely rich concentrate. But she's saying, how can something so short be so packed with so many meanings? How does that kind of technically work if we want to say that all of these readings are in the text? In practice, I think we often kind of experience reading or interpretation as if there was a kind of spectrum of there-ness, as I'm going to call it. So the letters on the Herculaneum scrolls, they're definitely there. They are there. That's not us. We didn't put them there with our magic X-rays. They're on the scrolls. They're there. Deviant focalization is a little bit less there. It's a contemporary term which wouldn't mean anything to Virgil, so we don't share it with the author of the text, so it's less there. But I think most of us are willing to kind of go, actually, there are certainly different points of view in the Aeneid. There are moments when we look at things from an unexpected point of view. So, all right, I'll accept that deviant focalization might be a useful way of getting something out of the text that is there, that Virgil kind of put there, and that was visible to him and to his original audience. In my own work, I've used Sigmund Freud's concept of Nachträglichkeit, or belatedness, or what James Strachey translates as deferred effect, to explain certain structural and temporal effects, again, in the Aeneid. And I think that's slightly less there, or accepted as slightly less there than deviant focalization, and even less than the letters on the Herculaneum scrolls. Okay, maybe people are willing to go, yes, I can kind of see something that Virgil is doing with time if we use this concept of Nachträglichkeit, but this is very much a kind of creative or a fusion of contemporary reading practices with an ancient text. So it's bringing something to the text that's simply not there. Further down the track, certain technologies or hermeneutic apparatuses or lenses are more often thought of or accused of being anachronistic. So, for example, readings based in contemporary sexual or ethnic identities, you'll get often a fair amount of pushback for saying that Virgil was gay or that Cleopatra was black. And if we see these things in ancient texts, if we see Sappho as a lesbian, Virgil as a gay man, Cleopatra as a black woman, This is because we are bringing our own identities, our own hang-ups to the text, not because, as I would probably more likely argue, our hermeneutic devices and the cultural competences we've developed, often as the result of being a member of a marginalised group, have alerted us to their actual presence in the text. And then kind of on the very much not there, but there is still kind of debate about where the kind of queerness of a text is, or the blackness of a text is. On the very far end, there's a wonderful moment in Derrida's book, The Postcard, where he's reading an image from a medieval fortune-telling book of Plato and Socrates, and saying, I can see Plato pushing off on his skateboard. I can see Plato ringing the bell on the tram. And there are very few people who would go, yes, there is a skateboard in this 14th century fortune-telling book. Derrida has alerted us to its presence. Well done, Derrida. So we kind of can almost place almost all readings of a text, or things that one might find in a text, on this kind of spectrum of how much we think they are, yes, that's in the text, and how much we think, no, that's definitely Derrida seeing something that isn't there, bringing his own contemporary stuff to it. I would argue, of course, I think that where we place things on the spectrum of there-ness is itself very often an ideological artifact. So it often depends what we assign to timelessness, what we think is part of being human, or literature itself. That can be in a text, and what we think is very kind of historically contingent, skateboards, for example, we will refuse to see in a text. So this is one of the reasons why queerness and blackness and particular identity categories are often the most controversial, because the argument is not so much about whether they're there in the text, but about whether they are trans-historically real categories. So although it's often, people are very quick to say, there were no gay people prior to the 19th century, or occasionally there were no gay people prior to Stonewall, or this is, homosexuality is a modern identity category which we cannot impose on the past. Of course, the same goes for heterosexuality, and very few people are kind of going, it's so appalling that people talk as though Odysseus and Penelope's marriage had anything to do with what we would call marriage today, even though this is just as anachronistic as claiming that Virgil was gay. However, we tend to assign heterosexuality and marriage to the side of the timeless, the universal, the non-historically contingent, and we tend to assign other identities, particularly marginalized identity, to the side of the time-bound. So I would argue that a lot of the ways in which we decide what is there in a text come down to arguments over legitimacy and ideology in the present. Others would say, or we would like to think, that we can adjudicate between these degrees of there-ness by appealing to the text, by looking at the text. Seriously, there are letters on this scroll. I can see them with this X-ray device, and there isn't a skateboard in the picture. The end. Let's just look at the text, and the text will be kind of evidence for it. But as Roland Barthes said back in the late 60s, only the text does not exist. So Tony Bennett then elaborates on this a little bit later in the 1980s and says what is constructed as the text itself is the product of a particular bid for the terms of the intertextual, ideological and cultural reference that are to prevail in organising reading practices, which is a very nicely distilled way of saying what I just tried to explain, that whenever we say this is in the text, we are making a bid for what counts as in the text, and naturalizing our own reading practices and rendering invisible the hermeneutic apparatuses and the personal orientations and dispositions that we are bringing to the text in order to make those things visible in the first place, and just go, no, it's there. Whereas in fact, it may or may not have been there before we found it. Brendan Breed says it much more simply, it's just reception all the way down. He's a biblical scholar. And the reason for this kind of miraginess of the text, or the text as something which doesn't exist, as something we can point to and say, yes, there are letters in it, no, there is not a skateboard in it, is because a text doesn't tell us what to see in itself. So Gerald Graff says, something that I resonate with enormously as a teacher. The reason most students are baffled by what they ask them to do, what we ask them to do, is that they do not know what kind of thing it is that they are supposed to say about literary works. And they can't infer those kinds of things from the literary works themselves, because literary works themselves don't tell one what it is one is supposed to say about them. The texts just sit there and we come up with things to say about them, which will be different, as we know, in different contexts. If I'm talking about Virgil to a non-classicist, or if I'm reading him for pleasure, I will say very different things from when I'm trying to write a paper on him for an OUP collection, for example. And this, I think, the idea that texts don't tell one what it is one is supposed to say about them, is on one level, one of the most obvious implications of reception theory or reception history or reception studies, especially if you're a classicist, because if a text told one what to say about it, then we would have been saying the same thing about the Aeneid for 2,000 years, and we really, really haven't been. So on the one hand, it's the most obvious corollary of thinking about reception, and on the other hand, I think it's one of the hardest things to accept or to fully embrace the implications of. And I find kind of Esa, in particular, his kind of work in the 70s, has this kind of, you can just watch him doing this dance where he says texts are instructions for meaning production and readers construct the meaning. But then he kind of steps back from the implications of that consistently and goes, but there is a right way to construct the meaning, and text will tell you how to do that, so it's okay. Yes, you're bringing something to the text, but you're kind of bringing the right thing to the text. So he argues that texts are instructions for meaning production, so they're meaningless unless we decode the text according to particular conventions. But then he basically cheats and says that the literary text relates to conventions which it carries with it. So the text needs to be decoded according to conventions which are not in the text, but it somehow carries them with it, except that it doesn't. And any kind of glance at Dante's reading of Virgil, for example, will tell us that he is reading according to profoundly different conventions from those which Virgil's original readers would have used. The Aeneid is not bringing conventions for reading it with it in any sense. So different readers will read according to different conventions, different regimes, different rules, different orientations, and so on. They will bring things to the text, technologies, interpretive norms, personal investments, particular competences, particular literacies, a whole kind of bundle of things that will cause them to see or not to see particular things in it. And one of my favourite examples, which Maria at least has seen quite recently, is this one. So this is from a paper comparing autistic and neurotypical viewers of films and using eye tracking software to see what do autistic people and neurotypical people literally see when they look at a movie. So they've picked, very sensibly, they've picked Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is, which I still haven't looked up. It was from, who asked me? I didn't know. From the 60s. So it's a movie about Martha, played by Elizabeth Taylor here, George, played by Richard Burton here, and Nick, played by someone that nobody remembers here on the right. So Martha and George are married, and their marriage is in terrible trouble, and there is all kinds of tension and drama, and Martha is flirting with Nick to try and wind George up, and during this scene we kind of watch George in the background getting more and more angry, and at the end of the scene he kind of bursts out in rage. It's a very good movie to pick to investigate autistic viewing practices, because really nothing happens in it except humans having emotions and interacting socially, often in very kind of oblique and unexpressed ways. So nothing gets stolen, there's no heists, nothing gets blown up. The narrative events, the things that you're watching for, are all on the level of human emotion and social interaction, which are often cues that autistic people find difficult to read. So this is a movie where you will have perhaps one of the sharpest divergences between autistic and non-autistic viewing practices. So what we see here is a screen with a particular kind of composition, but but with a number of different objects in it. One's eyes could roam freely over the scene. You could look at the books, you could look at whatever this thing is, you could look at the costumes, you could be like, this is a wonderful kind of 60s movie, you could look at the hair. There are any number of objects or signs on the screen that you might consider salient. But what we find is that non-autistic viewers' eyes follow this yellow pattern. So they watch the eyes mainly of the characters. They flip back and forth between the two main characters who are flirting, but they also flip to George to see how he's reacting in the background. They literally create a love triangle. They literally kind of draw it on the screen with their eyes. They follow what seems to be a kind of compositional structure in the visual image itself, but they make that triangle. And they do that because they understand how to watch the movie according to particular social, generic, and artistic conventions. Whereas your autistic viewers are missing this completely because George is not speaking. So they don't know that they're supposed to be looking at him. They're like, well, there's some guy in the background, but there's also some books in the background. You can't look at everything. So they focus mostly on Nick's mouth. And although the researchers don't mention this, Elizabeth Taylor's breasts, but they don't look at George. And so they miss the love triangle. They look at the speakers. So we can see the triangle as part of the visual composition of the scene, as if it was a structural feature of the text, entirely independent of its reception. But I would argue it only becomes a triangle when a reader applies the right conventions and creates the triangle with their eye movements, and not all readers do that. So it's not exactly in the text, and it's not exactly in the reader. Rita Felsky, who is kind of haunting this paper, gave a talk at Wollongong a few years ago, which she hasn't published yet, so I can't cite it as fully as I would like to. But in it, she cites Bruno Latour and talks about when we go to the art gallery and we see a painting and we go with our friend and we look at the painting, like, I don't really get it. And our friend points at it and goes, do you not see it's a unicorn? Or do you not see this feature of the painting? And you go, oh, wait, actually, I do. And she says, where is the agency in that? Is it in the artist who put the thing in the painting? Is it in me, because now I can see it? Is it in the friend who points me to it? It's a completely distributed mode of agency, and this is why she ends up kind of using actor network theory for everything, because she wants to say that all acts of reception are multiple actors connected on multiple networks, creating meaning in this very distributed kind of manner. But this example of the person pointing at the painting is very much what I experienced with the Dorothy Parker poem or the Winkler essay on the Odyssey. So I now see in the Odyssey the equivalence, the equality of Penelope and Odysseus. And I'm like, this is a great text because it gives us this fantastic kind of very early and very canonical model of a heterosexuality rooted in equality, and that's really cool. But I see it because Winkler and Parker showed it to me, because they pointed it. And so now it's there, but was it there before they showed it to me? So who is putting it there? Is it me? Is it Homer? Is it Winkler? Is it Dorothy Parker? We just don't know, or I don't know. So this is a small, but I think clear and nice example of what Y.G. Dimmock calls the unstable ontology of the text. So she says texts are emerging phenomena, activated and to some extent constituted by the passage of time, by their continual transit through new semantic networks, modifying their tonality as they proceed. The object of literary studies is thus an object with an unstable ontology. So a text only is a text. Texts are designed to be read, right? So Ursula Le Guin says somewhere that the unread story is not a story. It's just little black marks on wood pulp. It's only when it's a different kind of object until it is read. When it is read is when it actually becomes a story in its interaction with a reader. So Dimmock argues again that the text is only a text in its interaction with a context, with a reader, with a reading regime, with a historical moment as it kind of passes through time. And she switches from the metaphor of the lens, the visual metaphors that I've been using so far in this paper to a much more productive metaphor. And I think it's interesting that in order to do so, she moves from the visual to the sonic. So her paper is called A Theory of Resonance, and she talks about background noise as, she says, an apt analogy for interpretive context. She says, you know, texts come to us and we listen to them, but always against a certain kind of background noise, which is always there. Which reminds me of John Cage, who was fascinated by silence, and he ended up going into an anechoic chamber, which is a completely soundproof room, I guess, where literally no sound from the outside world could penetrate, and discovered that it was extremely noisy in there because of his own breathing, the beating of his own heart, and the sounds of his own body. So whatever we do, there is going to be some, however much we try and seal ourselves off from an outside world, from our own context, and listen only to the purity of the signal coming to us from the ancient world, there will always be some kind of noise, if we're alive, that interacts with the signal that we hear. And Dimmock says, arguing against Stephen Greenblatt's assumption that noise is disruptive, that we should try and minimize the background noise and listen to the sound of the past as it transmits itself as purely as possible. She says, I want to argue that noise is beneficial, that it enriches the dynamics for interpretation. And says this is counterintuitive, but the argument echoes a recent scientific hypothesis about the beneficial effects of random noise on the detectability of sounds. So this is a phenomenon called stochastic resonance, in which a weak signal, certain frequencies in a signal, are boosted by background noise and become newly and complexly audible. So it's not, in fact, always the case that noise interferes with, or only interferes with, the pristine signal. It can actually boost certain of the frequencies of that signal, making them newly audible in new contexts. And I think this then is the answer to Felsky's question, which I began this paper with. So as the text travels through time, it goes through contexts and periods where it is inert, in Felsky's phrase, but then it reaches other periods or moments where whatever is going on in our present time resonates with the pre-existing patterns and frequencies of the text, and a new kind of music becomes audible. And so this is, of course, a version of what has often been called the two-way dynamic of reception, the idea that the present alters the past as much as the past shapes the present. So Hopkins and Martindale, in their recent Oxford History of Classical Reception in English Literature, argue that classical texts have been remade and refashioned by English writers in ways that might cast as much light on the originals as on their English derivatives. So he says that this idea that a literary reception or a rewriting of a text illuminates, casts light on, tells us something about the original. And of course, Martindale and Hopkins are to some extent drawing on the model of tradition put forward about 100 years ago. I think it might have been 1919, this essay. Well done, Eliot. So his essay, The Tradition and the Individual Talent, where he says, literature is kind of a system, the literature of a nation in particular, or of a continent. So it forms a particular kind of, all the works within a particular kind of tradition, I guess, or context, form an ideal order among themselves. And then if there is a new work of art, that kind of comes in and slightly changes the shape, modifies the ideal order. And Eliot says, okay, if this is true, if you approve this idea of order of the form of European or English literature, you will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And Mika Bowell, in her book quoting Caravaggio, where she says that old images are obliterated and new versions of old images are put in their place, picks up on Eliot's idea. And the subtitle of quoting Caravaggio is Preposterous Histories. So she says this reversal, which puts what came chronologically first, pre, as an after effect behind, post, its later recycling, is what I would like to call a preposterous history. So Bowell is doing exactly what she says. Her later art is to do with Caravaggio. She's drawing our attention to the kind of complex temporal punning going on in the word preposterous itself in the Eliot essay, which is a nice moment, I think. So this idea of the kind of preposterous history, or the two-way dynamic of reception, gives us a different model for the ontology of the text. As Y.G. Dimmock points out, it's an object with an unstable ontology, it's an emerging phenomenon, it's co-constituted or co-made by its readers in its context, it's co-produced as it moves through time. But it also, I think, challenges us or provokes us to think more rigorously on the basis of a different model for time, one which is aware of the complex interaction between past and present, and which is, among other things, more hospitable to anachronism as an irreducible element of historical inquiry. So Gadamer, the philosopher slash hermeneutic theorist who influenced Iser and Jauss, who were the Constance school that invented kind of reception theory, as then kind of mutated by Charles Martindale and kind of therefore the sort of great-grandfather, I suppose, of classical reception studies, or at least one strand of classical reception studies. Gadamer argues that we only understand a text when we know what it is saying to us, not what it is saying as such, but what it's saying to us. That's true understanding. And if we only understand it on its author's terms, then we've actually missed something important. So he says every age has to understand a transmitted text in its own way. The real meaning of a text is always co-determined by the historical situation of the interpreter. And he says, if we attempt to see the past on its own terms by just disregarding ourselves and entering fully into the horizon of the past text, so ignoring our own horizon, our own concerns, dispositions, interpretive regimes, etc., and just kind of entering into the past, then we think we understand. But he says, in fact, we have given up the claim to find in the past any truth that is valid and intelligible for ourselves. And so to some extent, what is the point? Okay, there is the past, but it doesn't speak to us. It has no point of contact with us. It has nothing to say to us. It's not, in fact, intelligible by us. It is only intelligible by other people who don't exist anymore. So Gadamer would argue that this is only kind of half an understanding. So one of the consequences of this for me is something that I've written about in a recent paper on turbulent temporalities, which is one of the ones on Xena Warrior Princess. And this implication is that we need, I think, to see anachronism, or the state of mixed time, non-linear time, the coexistence of past and present in the same moment. This is the originary situation. And the notion of time's arrow or linear time is a secondary formation or construction that we have created in order to try and cope with the complexity of anachronistic time. So Dipesh Chakrabarty, in a great book called Provincializing Europe, which has been taken up both by Rita Felsky and by Carolyn Dinshaw in her book How Soon Is Now, which is on medieval temporalities. Chakrabarty argues that it's only a specific form of modern Western historical consciousness which allows us to see some of the things around us as bits of the past. So he says, you know, the past is present, otherwise we couldn't interact with it, see it, or know it. We are in the present. If we are engaging with the past, then ipso facto, the past is in our present time. And he says historical consciousness is produced by our capacity to see something that is contemporaneous with us, it's just sitting there being in the present, as a relic of another time or place. So the person gifted with historical consciousness sees these objects as things that once belonged to their historical context and now exist in the observer's time as a bit of the past. If such an object continues to have effects on the present, then the historically minded person sees that as the effect of the past, not the effect of the object, the present object. So Chakrabarty is, okay, there are two things about Chakrabarty's argument. One of them is that he takes it through an argument around colonization and the invention of empty historical time by the West, and the way in which historically the people who were going around kind of going, okay, this object, this ruin is a bit of the past, were the same people that were going around going, okay, this culture, this contemporary culture is an old or primitive culture and comes from a different bit of kind of historical time, or is kind of delayed in its progress towards modernity. So there is something to be suspicious about in this notion that things that we interact with in the present day are survivals of the past, simply on the basis that this idea came about in part as a justification of colonialism. But I also think that this is just simply true, that past texts, past objects are always seen, known, read, interacted with in the context of our present day. So the past is present insofar as we're able to see it, touch it, interact with it, know it. And it's always us, it's always someone. It's always someone who is themselves historically situated, who is interacting with it, bringing their background noise to it, boosting certain of its frequencies, unable to hear others. So the text is something which is co-produced by its readers in time, in a complex kind of now of reading, which is made up of both the present and the past in a kind of strange mixed temporality. The question kind of is, and the question that I want to finish on is, what do we do about this? Because I think classical reception has kind of faced a choice here, which is fairly easy to caricature as, on the one hand, a kind of naive historical positivism, where we can and should discover what past texts meant in their original context. So the Richard Jenkins position, where you scrape the barnacles of tradition off the text and you discover it as it really was, and go, great, now I know exactly what Virgil meant, or I know really what this text is, and anything that has come since then is simply kind of obscuring the lines, the formal structure, the aesthetic unity of this text as it was. So on the one hand, we can kind of go, haha, this is just sheer kind of historical positivism and it's very naive, and of course we can never recover what a text originally meant to its original audience because, history. On the other hand, the risk is, or the position that gets caricatured is an unethical and or superficial paronthocentrism, which is a nice Mika Bal word. Martindale uses it as well, I think, but a present-centeredness, where we simply impose contemporary standards on ancient texts and erase historical otherness. So just as Gardner kind of says, look, really what is the point of reading a text if we give up the claim to find any truth that is valid and intelligible for us, for ourselves? Emilio Betti, an Italian theorist, says, okay, but if the past doesn't have anything to say to us of its own accord, then why listen? Why do we need to go to the Herculaneum scrolls if all we're going to find is what we know already, if all we're going to get is our own positions and our own knowledges reflected back to us? So on the one hand, we have the kind of barnacle position where the text has nothing to say to us because it's simply a past text. And on the other hand, we have a position where the text has nothing to say to us because it's a purely present text. And I think both of those positions, the problem with both of those positions is that they stem from a linear notion of time. So they come from the idea that just as we could easily separate out the text from the reader or the text from its reception in some way, we could go, this is the text, just the text, only the text itself, and this is what other people make of it. And I think we cannot make that separation easily. But I also think that we cannot separate easily the past from the present. I think just as the text and the reader co-produce one another, the past and the present co-produce one another, or perhaps there is a complex relationship of interpenetration between past, present, and future in any given moment that we call now. So Chakrabarty writes about this, and Dinshaw, and to some extent me. So Felsky as well says that time is not a tidy sequence of partitioned units, past, present, future. 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, whatever, yesterday, today, tomorrow, but a profusion of whirlpools and rapids, eddies and flows, in which objects, ideas, images and texts from different moments swirl, tumble and collide in ever-changing combinations and constellations. Pastness is part of who we are, not an archaic residue, a regressive force, a source of nostalgia, or a return of the repressed. So what we need to do instead of either trying to reclaim the past as it truly was, or use the past as a resource for seeing ourselves over and over again, is to embrace the turbulence of time, as Rita Felsky calls it, and begin writing the preposterous histories of the classical past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ika. One of the main reasons why I really wanted Ika to come and be part of this seminar series was because, well, I've always greatly admired your work ever since we were teaching together a little bit at Bristol, but my mind always harks back to a paper that you gave in Bristol, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, that has always stuck in my head of being just the best example of how some people, and they are very few, can make critical theory accessible and intelligible. And I think Ika is one of those very few people. And so, yeah, I really appreciate what you've done in setting out some of these really kind of current ideas around reading and reception, and given us some really provocative and thought-provoking insights into them. So we have some time for questions. I will open the floor if anyone would like to begin. Oh gosh,
Sorry,
live stream.
Bye, live stream.